The average American farm uses 1 acre to produce 200 pounds of potatoes at a cost of $3,000 in fuel, chemicals, and machinery. And that model only works with cheap diesel and massive equipment access rows that waste 60% of your land. But one Japanese farmer produces 2,000 pounds of vegetables on a quarter acre. That's 10 times the output per square foot. That's 40 times the productivity per acre. And here's the system that makes it possible. It's not exotic technology. It's intelligent spacing, vertical layering, succession timing, and closed-loop fertility refined over 1,000 years. This is how to turn a suburban backyard into a food production system that outproduces industrial farms. Think about your garden right now. You're spacing tomatoes 3 feet apart because the seed packet says so. You're planting 1 crop per bed because that looks normal. You're tilling every spring because your neighbor does. And you're producing maybe 150 pounds of food from 200 square feet of garden space. Meanwhile, Japanese intensive farmers produce 800 pounds from the same 200 square feet. Same sunlight, same soil biology, same growing season length, but 5 times the output because they're using space as a 3-dimensional resource instead of a flat surface. And here's why American farms get it wrong. The standard model is designed around mechanical access, not biological productivity. You need 3-foot spacing for a tiller to fit between rows. You need 4-foot paths for a wheelbarrow. You need pest buffer zones because monoculture invites concentrated attacks. Add it up, and 60 to 70% of your garden footprint produces nothing. It's dead space, compacted pathways, empty gaps between plants. And those widely spaced plants compete poorly with weeds, lose moisture to evaporation, and create microclimates that invite pests because there's no diversity to confuse them. Japanese intensive methods flip the entire framework because the foundation is permanent raised beds that are never walked on, never tilled, and never left bare. These beds are 18 to 24 inches deep and 3 to 4 feet wide. The width lets you reach the center from either side without stepping on the growing area. The depth allows roots to penetrate into loose, biologically active soil that improves every season instead of degrading. And because you never compact the soil, you never need to till, which means soil structure stays intact, fungal networks remain undisturbed, and carbon builds instead of oxidizing into the atmosphere. But the real multiplication happens when you treat that bed as a vertical system instead of a horizontal surface. Traditional American gardens plant 1 layer. Tomatoes at ground level, 3 feet apart, with bare soil between them. Intensive Japanese beds plant 4 layers in the same footprint. Layer 1 is tall crops like pole beans or trellis tomatoes growing 6 feet high. Layer 2 is mid-height crops like peppers or bush beans at 2 to 3 feet. Layer 3 is low crops like lettuce, spinach, and herbs at 6 to 12 inches. Layer 4 is ground cover plants like clover or thyme that shade out weeds, retain moisture, and fix nitrogen directly into the root zone. That's the first principle, vertical layering. Now stack succession planting on top of that vertical structure, because that's the second principle. Traditional gardens plant lettuce once in spring, harvest it in 6 weeks, then leave the space empty for 4 months until fall. Intensive beds plant new lettuce every 10 days from March through October. That means continuous harvest instead of feast or famine cycles. You're eating fresh greens every single week, while that same square foot produces 6 to 8 full crops across the season instead of 1. Apply that logic to radishes, green onions, Asian greens, and fast-turn root vegetables, and you've just multiplied your yield per square foot by 4 to 6 times through time stacking alone. The math becomes undeniable when you compare footage. A traditional 4 by 8 foot bed with 3-foot tomato spacing fits 3 plants. Those 3 plants produce about 45 pounds of tomatoes across the season. An intensive bed of the same size fits 9 tomato plants at 18-inch spacing because you never walk on the bed, so soil stays loose and roots access water and nutrients efficiently. But you're not just planting tomatoes. Between those 9 tomato plants, you're interplanting 18 basil plants that repel aphids and improve tomato flavor. Around the edges, you're planting 24 marigolds that confuse whiteflies and attract beneficial predators. At ground level, you've seeded clover that fixes 40 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year directly into the soil. That single 32 square foot bed now produces 120 pounds of tomatoes, continuous basil harvests, and builds soil fertility, while the traditional bed produced 45 pounds and depleted nutrients. And that's just one bed operating under 3 principles. The system is built on 7 core laws refined over centuries. Law 1 is permanent beds with no-till management, because tilling destroys fungal networks, oxidizes carbon, and creates compaction layers at plow depth. Permanent beds build topsoil every year. Law 2 is vertical layering, where every cubic foot of airspace produces food, not just the surface. Law 3 is succession planting, that turns time into a multiplier. Law 4 is polyculture instead of monoculture, because diversity equals resilience. Plant families support each other through complementary root depths, nutrient needs, and pest confusion. Law 5 is closed-loop fertility, where nitrogen-fixing plants feed heavy feeders, chop-and-drop mulch returns carbon to soil, and compost stays on site. Nothing is imported, nothing is wasted. Law 6 is water harvested and retained through mulch, deep roots, and soil structure instead of constant irrigation. Law 7 is seed saving that adapts varieties to your specific microclimate, making you independent from supply chains. These aren't abstract philosophies, they're operational mechanics. Take the concept of companion polycultures. Traditional gardens plant tomatoes in one bed, beans in another, squash in a third. Intensive beds plant them together because they create a functional system. Beans climb the tomato stakes, saving horizontal space. Bean roots fix nitrogen that tomatoes need as heavy feeders. Squash sprawls at ground level, shading out weeds and retaining moisture. The combination produces more total food per square foot than any single crop could. And it does so without fertilizer, because the beans manufacture it. That's not mysticism. That's nitrogen biochemistry and spatial optimization. The Japanese adapted this from indigenous American polyculture, refined it through their own constrained land availability, and turned it into a science. The famous Three Sisters combination is corn, beans, and squash. Intensive Japanese beds adapt that to suburban constraints by substituting trellised cucumbers for sprawling squash and using determinate varieties that fit tighter spacing. The principle remains: tall plants provide structure, climbers use vertical space, ground covers suppress weeds, and nitrogen fixers feed the system. You're not fighting nature, you're designing relationships that regulate themselves. Now here's where the multiplication accelerates, because you've built permanent beds and you understand vertical layering. But the real productivity explosion happens when you integrate succession timing with companion relationships and close the nutrient loop so fertility builds instead of depleting. This is where intensive Japanese systems separate from everything garden centers teach you. Start with succession planting mechanics. Traditional gardens plant 20 lettuce heads in April, harvest them all in May, then stare at empty soil until fall. Intensive beds plant 4 lettuce heads every 10 days from March through October. That's 28 planting dates producing 112 heads from the same square footage that produced 20. You're harvesting 4 heads per week for 7 months, instead of 20 heads in one overwhelming May weekend. The same principle applies to radishes, green onions, spinach, Asian greens, bush beans, and any crop with a 30 to 60 day maturity window. Every 7 to 10 days, you seed a new 2-foot section. Every 7 to 10 days, you harvest a mature section. The bed becomes a continuous production line instead of a one-time event. And here's a specific calendar for one 4 by 8 foot bed across a season. March 15th. Plant 4 lettuce, 12 radishes, 8 green onions in the first 2 feet. March 25th. Plant the same mix in the next 2 feet. April 5th. Plant the same in the 3rd section. April 15th. Plant the 4th section. By May 1st, you're harvesting the March 15th section, while the April 15th section is still emerging. You replant that harvested 2-foot section immediately with the same mix. You've created a 10-day rotation where something is always ready and something is always growing. That's 6 full rotations across a 180-day season, turning one bed into 6 sequential harvests from the same soil. But you're not just planting lettuce because you're integrating vertical layers and companion relationships simultaneously. Between those succession-planted greens, you've installed 6 tomato plants at 18-inch spacing. The tomatoes grow slowly in April and May, while the greens thrive in cool weather and lower light. By June, when tomatoes need full sun and the greens bolt from heat, you've already harvested 3 complete green rotations, and the tomato canopy is just filling in. Around each tomato, you've planted 2 basil plants. Basil repels aphids and thrips through aromatic compounds. At the base of every tomato, you've seeded white clover. Clover fixes 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per season, acts as living mulch that shades out weeds and retains moisture, and requires 0 maintenance because you just mow it with scissors when it gets tall, dropping the clippings in place. That's the closed-loop fertility mechanism. Traditional gardens buy nitrogen in bags, apply it to soil, watch 50% leach away, then buy more next year. Intensive beds plant legumes as functional crops and ground covers. Peas and beans in spring. Clover as permanent understory. Vetch as winter cover. These plants host rhizobia bacteria in root nodules that convert atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available nitrate. When you chop legume plants at soil level and leave the roots in place, you're depositing 3 to 4% nitrogen by dry weight directly into the root zone. One mature pea plant contributes the nitrogen equivalent of 2 tablespoons of synthetic fertilizer. 20 pea plants in one bed equal a 40-tablespoon nitrogen injection that didn't cost anything, didn't leach into groundwater, and didn't kill soil microbes. And now layer in the chop-and-drop maintenance system. When those early-season peas finish producing in June, you don't pull them. You cut them at the base and leave them on the bed surface as mulch. The stems and leaves contain captured nitrogen, carbon, and micronutrients. As they decompose, fungi and bacteria break them down into humus, while earthworms pull fragments into the soil profile. You've just fertilized, mulched, and improved soil structure in one action that took 30 seconds. When basil gets leggy, you prune it back and drop the trimmings around the tomatoes. When tomatoes produce side shoots, you pinch them and drop them as mulch. Everything returns to the system. The bed becomes a closed nutrient loop where biological processes replace purchased inputs. And here's the yield math that proves the system. A traditional 4 by 8 foot tomato bed with 3 plants spaced 3 feet apart produces 45 pounds of tomatoes and nothing else. An intensive bed of identical size with 9 tomato plants at 18-inch spacing produces 120 pounds of tomatoes. But you've also harvested 6 succession rotations of mixed greens, totaling 30 pounds. You've harvested continuous basil, adding 5 pounds. The clover fixed nitrogen worth $15 in fertilizer equivalent and suppressed weeds that would have cost you 10 hours of labor. Total production, 155 pounds of food plus $15 in fertility and 10 hours returned. That's not 3 times the yield. That's 5 times when you count the labor and input savings. The principle scales across all crop families because brassicas like cabbage and kale are heavy feeders. You plant them in beds where legumes grew the previous season or where clover is actively fixing nitrogen as a ground cover. Roots like carrots and beets are moderate feeders. You plant them after brassicas have extracted nitrogen, but before the soil is depleted. Then you return to legumes to rebuild. That's the simplified 3-year rotation adapted for intensive beds. Year 1, legumes and greens. Year 2, heavy feeders like tomatoes and brassicas. Year 3, roots and alliums. The bed never sits empty and never needs external fertility because the rotation itself rebuilds what each phase consumes. And now, shift to crop selection strategy. Not all vegetables are created equal when you're maximizing output per square foot. Corn is a terrible intensive crop. It requires 12 inches of spacing, produces 1 to 2 ears per stalk, and each ear provides 100 calories. That's 100 calories per square foot at best. Potatoes are the opposite. Plant 1 seed potato per 8 inches in an 18-inch deep bed. Each plant produces 2 to 4 pounds of tubers. That's 400 to 800 calories per square foot. Potatoes are 8 times more calorie efficient than corn in the same space. Bush beans mature in 50 days and produce half a pound per plant. With 6-inch spacing, you're getting 3 pounds per square foot every 50 days. Plant in succession every 2 weeks, and you're harvesting continuously from June through September, turning 1 square foot into 15 pounds across the season. Asian greens like bok choy, mizuna, and tatsoi mature in 30 to 45 days. You can fit 4 plants per square foot. That's 4 harvests per season per square foot, producing 8 to 12 pounds of nutrient-dense greens from space that would hold 1 lettuce head in a traditional garden. Radishes are even faster, 25 days from seed to harvest. Use them as gap fillers between slower crops. Plant radish seeds along the edge of carrot rows. Radishes mark the row so you know where carrots are germinating. Then you harvest the radishes 3 weeks before carrots need the space. Same square footage produces 2 crops with 0 conflict. This is the intercropping pattern that defines intensive Japanese beds. You're not planting crops in isolation. You're planting relationships. Lettuce grows fast in the spring shade of tomato seedlings, then gets harvested before tomatoes need the canopy space. Radishes germinate in 5 days and mature in 25, harvested before the adjacent carrots even develop true leaves. Bush beans fix nitrogen while shading the soil for neighboring beets. Every plant has a function beyond its own harvest. Nitrogen source, living mulch, pest confuser, space placeholder, or microclimate modifier. Now extend the season so this system runs year-round instead of 4 months. Traditional gardens shut down in October and restart in April. Intensive beds use microclimates, protective covers, and strategic crop selection to produce food 12 months per year, even in Zone 6 climates. Row covers are translucent fabric stretched over hoops that add 4 to 6 weeks on both ends of the season. A $30 row cover lets you plant lettuce in February and harvest greens through November. Cold frames are bottomless boxes with transparent lids that create 10 to 15 degree temperature buffers. Plant spinach, mosh, and claytonia in September inside a cold frame and harvest fresh greens all winter. The plants grow slowly, but they grow, turning a dead season into productive months. Microclimate management multiplies these effects. Tall plants create shade zones that extend cool season crops into summer heat. Plant lettuce in the north shadow of a tomato row, and it stays productive through July instead of bolting in May. Thermal mass like water-filled barrels or stone pavers absorb daytime heat and release it at night, protecting tender plants from early frosts. Dark mulch warms soil in spring for heat-loving crops. Light-colored mulch cools soil in summer for greens. You're not fighting your climate. You're creating dozens of microzones within a single bed where different crops find their ideal conditions simultaneously. And water management in intensive beds operates on entirely different physics than traditional gardens. Standard advice says water frequently and shallowly. Intensive beds use infrequent, deep watering that trains roots to penetrate 12 to 18 inches down where moisture and nutrients concentrate. Deep roots mean drought resistance. Plants access water reservoirs that surface-rooted plants never reach. Mulch layers 2 to 4 inches thick reduce evaporation by 50%, suppress weeds that compete for moisture, and moderate soil temperature swings. Drip irrigation delivers water directly to root zones, with zero waste from overspray or evaporation. One intensive bed uses 40% less water than a traditional bed, producing half the yield because every drop goes where it's needed and soil structure holds it there. Here's the complete productivity equation for one optimized bed. Take a 4 by 8 foot bed, 32 square feet of surface area. Traditional planting. 3 tomato plants producing 45 pounds, harvested once in August. Intensive method with full integration. 9 tomato plants at 18-inch spacing, producing 120 pounds. 6 succession plantings of mixed greens from March through October, producing 35 pounds total. Continuous basil harvests totaling 6 pounds. Radishes and green onions intercropped in the gaps, producing 8 pounds. White clover as ground cover, fixing 1.5 pounds of nitrogen and suppressing weeds worth 8 hours of labor. Total, 169 pounds of produce from 32 square feet. That's 5.3 pounds per square foot. Traditional method produced 1.4 pounds per square foot. You've multiplied output by 3.8 times using the same sunlight, same water, same growing season, but completely different spatial and temporal design. The time multiplication is equally dramatic. Traditional gardens plant once and harvest once per crop. Intensive beds plant the same space 3 to 4 times per season through succession timing. Spring peas from March to May, followed immediately by summer tomatoes from June to September, followed by fall brassicas from October to December. Same square footage, 3 complete crops, 0 downtime. That single bed just produced food for 10 months instead of 3. Scale that across 8 beds, and you've converted a 256 square foot garden into a production system that rivals quarter-acre commercial farms in total yield. And here's where the system becomes truly self-regulating. Pest and disease pressure drops dramatically in polyculture environments because there's no monoculture to exploit. Aphids searching for tomatoes encounter basil, marigolds, onions, and clover in the same bed. The olfactory confusion reduces infestation rates by 60 to 80% compared to pure tomato blocks. Crop rotation across beds means soil-borne diseases never build up. Tomatoes in bed 1 this year, bed 3 next year, bed 5 the year after. By the time tomatoes return to bed 1, the pathogens are dead. You're managing ecosystems instead of fighting invasions, and the ecosystem naturally maintains balance when you give it structural diversity. Input independence follows automatically. After the first year of building soil structure and establishing perennial ground covers, your only external input is seeds. But you're saving seeds from your best performers, so by year 3, even seeds cost nothing. Fertility comes from nitrogen-fixing legumes and chop-and-drop mulch. Water comes from rain captured in soil structure and conserved by mulch. Pest control comes from companion diversity and beneficial insect habitat. You've built a closed-loop system that produces more food every year while requiring less intervention. That's the opposite of industrial agriculture, which depletes soil, requires increasing chemical inputs, and produces diminishing returns. Now here's the scaling pathway. Year 1. Build 2 4x8 beds, 64 square feet total. Focus on mastering vertical layering and succession timing with 5 crop types: tomatoes, lettuce, beans, radishes, and herbs. Expect 300 to 400 pounds of production. That's enough to cut your grocery produce spending by 40%. Year 2. Add 4 more beds, 256 square feet total. Add potatoes, onions, brassicas, and winter squash. Integrate chickens for eggs and manure if local rules allow. Production jumps to 1,200 pounds. You're now growing 70% of your household vegetables. Year 3. Expand to 12 beds, 384 square feet. Add season extension with cold frames. Implement full succession calendars. Production reaches 1,800 to 2,000 pounds annually. At this point, you're spending more time preserving harvest than planting because the system is producing continuously. And compare that to the American farm model. Industrial farms average 200 pounds of potatoes per acre, using tractors, synthetic nitrogen, herbicides, and fungicides. Your quarter-acre intensive system, which is 0.25 acres or roughly 10,000 square feet, produces 2,500 pounds of mixed vegetables using hand tools, compost, and rainwater. That's 12.5 times the productivity per acre. The math is even more brutal per square foot. Industrial farms produce 0.005 pounds per square foot. Your intensive beds produce 5 pounds per square foot. That's a 1,000 times efficiency gain when you measure output against footprint. The cost comparison is equally stark. The average American family spends $6,000 annually on produce. A quarter-acre intensive garden producing 2,500 pounds of vegetables has a retail equivalent value of $8,000 to $10,000, depending on organic pricing. Your input costs after year one are approximately $200 in seeds and amendments. You've converted a $6,000 annual expense into a $200 expense, while improving nutrition, eliminating food miles, and building soil instead of mining it. And you're doing this in your backyard, using techniques that indigenous cultures developed and Japanese farmers refined into a precision system over a millennium. The American industrial model wastes 60% of land on access rows, depletes soil through tillage, creates pest monocultures, depends on cheap fossil fuels, and requires constant chemical inputs. The intensive Japanese model uses 95% of land area, builds soil through permanent beds, creates pest-resistant polycultures, runs on sunlight and rainfall, and eliminates external inputs through closed-loop design. One model extracts and degrades, the other model builds and regenerates, and the regenerative model produces 10 times more food per square foot because it's working with biological systems instead of fighting them. You don't need a farm, you don't need acreage, you need 200 square feet, permanent raised beds, vertical layering, succession timing, and companion polycultures. Start today. Mark 2 4x8 beds in your sunniest space. Build them 18 inches deep with untreated lumber or concrete blocks. Fill them with 60% topsoil and 40% compost. Plant your first vertical succession. Tomatoes with basil and marigolds, lettuce in the gaps, clover as ground cover. Water deeply once per week. Harvest continuously. Add 2 more beds next spring. You're not gardening anymore. You're operating a food production system that outproduces industrial farms per square foot because you're using intelligence instead of acreage. The system works because it's been working for 1,000 years. Build it one bed at a time.